Previously on Tim's Book Quest.
I've been trapped underground for weeks now, but I think I finally found a tunnel out of here. Just shrink my books down, take with me on my epic journey, all my books right here in my pocket. Oh, it's you guys again. I found a tunnel out of the City of Dark Elves and into the subterranean labyrinth, and I'm about to head in. I get the feeling that I'm at the beginning of an epic journey, so it's only fitting that I explore the beginnings of the epic fantasy genre. It's The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Alright, now I know a lot more about journeys and beginnings. That should come in handy trying to hide from monsters and not die of dehydration or exposure in an underground labyrinth, but before I head in, let's talk about what I just read. The Hobbit, published in 1937, needs little introduction. It's one of the most well-regarded and widely read novels of all time, has been adapted across all forms of media, and of course kicked off both Tolkien's Middle-earth saga and the modern conception of the high fantasy novel in ways that roughly, 10,000 novels since have used as a creative springboard, which is to say, ripped off. But before we continue, we should first address the question, what is a hobbit? They're little people. They're goddamn little people who live in their cozy homes and their farms and their overeating and shit. You don't need to front with me, you know what? The story concerns a homebody hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, who is drafted by the wizard Gandalf to help 13 dwarves, Fili, Kili, Dwalin, Balin, Beaver, Bofer, Bomber, Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, Gloin, and their leader Thorin Oakenshield retrieve what they see as their stolen treasure and birthright, their pale enchanted gold, from the dragon Smaug. Their journey will see them encounter trolls, goblins, pardon me, spiders, slightly overzealous wood elves, and eventually, of course, a dragon before going to war, changing Bilbo forever. It's also about the Arkenstone. Wait, no it's not. What the hell? That was weird. It's hard to simultaneously discuss this book in the context of its own time and in literary and especially fantasy history, and also do a more subjective modern rereading of it. So I'll break this talk into 3 distinct sections, one for each of the angles I just discussed, and a third final section briefly skimming over its various adaptations and other forms of media sense. As I mentioned, The Hobbit is considered an iconic and essential novel, and it's easy to see why. Tolkien didn't quite invent elves or dwarves, but he sure as hell crafted and refined versions of them that have reverberated in high fantasy fiction of every medium under the sun for 80 years and counting since. And as far as I'm aware, he did invent hobbits and orcs, although the latter are almost exclusively referred to as goblins in this particular text. And beyond that, the general mythic feel and shape of much of contemporary medieval set high fantasy fiction finds its genesis here. A character setting out from a humble small town, growing in confidence and abilities, he journeys through a world of magic and monsters and wizards and fantastical races, culminating in a final showdown and big battle sequence. It's all right here, bouncing us along from episode to episode and encounter to encounter, with a spring in its hairy-footed step. Now, Bilbo in this novel doesn't obtain power in his journey in the way that a lot of fantasy heroes have since. He's not learning wizardry or anything like that. He's not flinging spells. Lightning bolt! Lightning bolt! He does still get gradually decked out with a magic sword and magic ring and some combat skills and whatnot, so it loosely falls within the hero's journey archetype, but I'd really say that it's less in the central character arc and more in the world building and the journey, where the Hobbit's influence extends across the ages. In that sense, at least for a fantasy fan such as myself, I don't know that it could be called anything less than one of the most important novels ever written, perhaps surpassed only in that regard by its own sequel, spin-off, whatever, The Lord of the Rings. Even my favorite fantasy novels since, none of them on their best day could have even 1% of its influence. Save The Lord of the Rings, I don't know that anything in what we broadly refer to as nerd culture in any medium had the same impact until arguably the original Star Trek series debuted on TV nearly 30 years later. So if you're looking for some boss contrarian to swagger in here and be like, The Hobbit, nah, not that influential. Yeah, sorry, no hot take from me there, but acknowledging something's influence isn't necessarily the same thing as unconditional endorsement. So that said, let's move on to talking about the real heart of the novel, the Arkenstone. Wait, no, what the hell? What is it with this Arkenstone? From long ago, when it's the prose and the pacing that jump out at me rereading The Hobbit getting on a century since its initial publication. Tolkien's writing here manages to blend a poetic, otherworldly flair and rich descriptions with a light and quaint, almost bouncy touch. What's interesting is that while the story of Bilbo himself is written in your standard third person, there's also plenty of first person, with the narrator referring to himself as if he's an oral storyteller, and even second person referring to you, the reader. So for example, in the very first chapter when Gandalf appears, we get, Gandalf, If you had heard only a quarter of what I have heard about him, and I have only heard very little of all there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Throw in references to the narrator and to your reading ass all over the place. Or in the Riddles in the Dark chapter with Gollum, where the narrator says, I should not have liked to be in Mr. Baggins' place all the same, or deep down here by the dark water lived old Gollum, a small slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. Now, this is obviously bullshit, as Tolkien the author knew well where Gollum came from, but presumably the narrator does not, thus making the narrator not literally just J.R.R. Tolkien, but a sort of unseen character. Now, for what it's worth, I'm certainly glad that this exact style didn't become an expected genre mainstay. I don't know that I much appreciate reading A Song of Ice and Fire and the prose being like, and I do swear there was a lot of rape in the aftermath of the city's sacking. I shudder to think of it. But at least here it's charming, and probably makes the book, if I'm being honest, more readable to me than the perhaps excessively biblical and austere tone of the proper Lord of the Rings. What? And as for the pacing, well, one of the cliches of the epic fantasy genre is in its slow starts, but The Hobbit really does blast out of the gate. We're on the road with Bilbs and Gandhi and the Dwarfy Boys by page 30 and encountering trolls just a few pages after that. No puttering around here. And after that, the key set pieces and encounters, be they with goblins under the mountain, or riddling with Gollum, or spiders, wood elves, and on to the end of the book, are stacked pretty closely on top of one another. There's really no time to get bored here, which isn't exactly the same thing as saying there's no breathing room. One thing I noticed compared to the way most adaptations have depicted the story is that there's a surprising number of sequences where the characters end up settling in for a bit and staying in one place for quite a while. They stay with Elrond at Rivendell for a while, Bjorn the Skin Changer for some time, they're camped out in the Mirkwood for days. Heck, they're imprisoned in the Wood Elves' fortress, Bilbo invisible and hiding out, for weeks before they make their escape. Even toward the climax of the book, they're camped under the Lonely Mountain for some time, plotting how best to approach their encounter with Smaug. They don't just reach the base of the mountain and saunter on in. This doesn't significantly affect the structure of the book per se, but does have a big impact on the way the book feels, especially as viewed through the titular character's journey. We're with him on a marathon, not a sprint. We're not just checking out a few strange weeks in the life of Bilbo Baggins, but over a year, and given its brisk page count, I think the book does a good job evoking that. What it also does a very good job with is its central character arc. Bilbo's evolving status with the group, going from initially being someone they just hired to be a burglar and very much an outsider to part of the gang to eventually in some ways supplanting Thorin as their leader, flows naturally and convincingly. By the time we get to places like the Wood Elves Fortress and Lake Town, Tolkien has done a good job depicting Bilbo as someone who surely loves his comfort, surely misses his hobbit hole, but has gotten pretty decent at this whole adventuring bit. Certainly more useful to the group than noted fat-ass Bombur. As long as we're on the dwarves, one of the criticisms I probably do have of the book, reading it from a more modern perspective, is that all the dwarves kind of merge together into sort of a vague and ill-defined sort of dwarven collective. We know that Thorin is the leader who gives way to gold-fueled greed later in the book, so that's a character, and Fili and Kili are younger than the rest, and Bombur, like I said, is fat. But beyond that, I read the book, but put a gun to my head and tell me to tell you literally anything about Oin or Bofer, and I'll just have to say my prayers, because to me they're nothing but names that my eyes occasionally glaze over. At risk of throwing out a cliche number of dwarves, would it have been that terrible if there was, say, 7 dwarves instead of 13? That way you could have folded more character traits into each, and you can keep Bombur, you can keep the fat comic relief, but that way maybe there'd be a bit more of a sting, a bit more of an impact, when a few of them are killed off in the big battle at the end. Let's talk about that ending a little bit. The whole Smaug attack on Lake Town and its aftermath is a great sequence, and I have no problems with, but I do take a few issues with the Battle of 5 Armies after that. At risk of receiving fan mail from Peter Jackson telling me he'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, I feel maybe the battle could have been a little longer than the 8 pages it is in my copy. Say if it was 18 pages. I don't think that would have harmed the pacing of the book one bit, while actually upping the drama and the stakes and the emotion a little. Now, I can already hear the Tolkien scholars getting on me all like, "You lowest common denominator fool. The Hobbit is not about action. It's about themes of courage and heroism and setting out into the world and not underestimating." Yeah, but I don't know. Read chapter 6 with their fighting and escaping the Goblin Cave, or chapter 8 with this extensive sequence, far longer than 8 pages of dodging and slicing up giant spiders, and try to tell me that the Hobbit is just a little bit about action. Now, that's not to claim that I'm not a lowest common denominator fool, just to say that even a lowest common denominator fool can be right sometimes. The Hobbit can be about relatable themes, and adventure, and action, and the Arkenstone. Where the hell is that? Also, I'm just gonna level with y'all, and maybe this is fantasy blasphemy, but there's way too much of this for my taste. I don't mind if a fantasy novel does this sort of lyrics, poetry thing maybe once or twice, but in The Hobbit it's just over and over again, dozens of times, some of them very long. And my eyes just glaze over with boredom every time. I'm not a poetry guy. Don't have a musically inclined brain, and with this stuff I can't do it. So overall, great iconic novel. A quiet and humanistic epic that marries adventure, world building, and charm into a whole that's still a breezy and enjoyable read decades upon decades down the line. Albeit not one that I'll give an unfettered, criticism-free pass to. Speaking of criticism, let's roll through these pretty quickly because this is supposed to be a book review and I gotta get my epic journey started. I somehow came across this, even here in the realm of magic and fantasy, the 1977 animated version of The Hobbit, directed by Rankin and Bass of Christmas special fame, and I'll be honest, it's great how much this sticks to the text of the novel, omitting little, adding little. This is definitely the plot of Tolkien's Hobbit. But film is a visual medium, and I'm sorry, this is just kinda hideous to me. I hate the cheap look and tacky designs of almost everything. Bilbo looks like a nightmare. The dwarves are for some reason all looking like near-death ancient white beards. And Smaug is a cat? Gandalf looks fine, and both Bard and his city of Laketown are alright. Though it is funny how the book's description of Laketown as a city of men has been overly literalized as a city of just men. Dude's ear got sore wrists, that's all I'm saying. So yeah, this one's not a favorite of mine. Don't like the look of it, feels rushed, and the non-stop singing drives me crazy. Now I've also come across this, The Hobbit comic book, graphic novel, whatever you want to call it, from 1989, and this is interesting. I'll say for the record that I do not read comic books, like, at all. The last one I read was Watchmen, back when Zack Snyder's movie came out in 2009, and I haven't read this one either. It's just not my medium, never has been, never will be. But skimming through it, the character designs look 100 times better than the animated film, and it looks like a dead-on accurate adaptation down to each line of dialogue, so I guess if you're a comic person, I'll recommend it. There's also a 2003 Hobbit video game for GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. I haven't played it, but I figured I'd mention this one's very strange existence. And that brings us to Peter Jackson's 2012 to 2014 Hobbit trilogy, and look, I didn't even like the sound of a Hobbit duology back when they were talking about doing it as 2 films back in the day. I thought that sounded ridiculous for a 300-page book. I said, why can't you just do a 3.25-hour movie, do the whole thing in one? So you can imagine how I feel about the Hobbit trilogy. It's just too much. Too many movies, too many action scenes, too much CGI, too much bullshit. More is not always better, okay? The visual design is still sometimes great. Laketown looks fantastic. New Zealand landscape's still great, terrific cast, and I'll totally praise the creative design work they did visually differentiating the dwarves. Riddles in the Dark with Gollum, perfect, and I'll even praise a couple narrative changes. Introducing Bard the Bowman before his Smaug encounter, exactly the right decision. But then I gotta watch scenes like this dude sporting some fake titties, and I'm like, what is this? How did this make it through basic quality control? Was no one in the edit bay like, this is stupid. This isn't Tolkien. And shut the hell up about the goddamn Arkenstone. The Arkenstone is not analogous to the One Ring, and acting like it is so stupid. It's assuming that us, the audience, are so stupid that we need the handicap of a magical MacGuffin to invest in the story, which we don't. Just no, I don't want to hear any more about the goddamn Arkenstone. Alright, that'll about do it for book and movie chat. Time to get started with my epic journey. First, I'll just need to make out what these mystical runes say about opening this door. Sing Arkenstone and enter.